So something that is Russian propaganda is very, very rich in. By genocidal rhetoric, we understand this idea that Ukraine should be wiped off the land, the earth, that Ukrainian language doesn't really exist, that Ukrainian culture doesn't really exist. So we'll try to analyze this in this episode. Nastya, let's start with you. What is genocidal rhetoric in your opinion?
When we talk about genocidal rhetoric, the first thing that occurs to us is something so violent. The rhetoric that calls on killing, extermination of nations, states, etc. But the interesting thing here is that genocidal rhetoric is not only direct call on extermination, killing, or committing war crimes. Genocidal rhetoric is also creating informational background for real genocide, as it is. So, according to one of the most prominent historians of our time, Timothy Snyder, there are several features that can help us understand that things we hear from Russian propaganda are calling on genocide or have genocidal intentions. For example, when propaganda presents its victim, in this case we're talking about Ukrainian people, or sometimes even Western countries. So when propaganda presents them as sub-states, inferior states, it's already informational background for genocide. When they deny existence of certain nation, when they deny existence of certain country, it's also one of the components. Another important part is dehumanization. When propaganda tells that Ukrainians are subhumans, or when they say that Ukrainians are monsters, it is also a certain kind of preparation of their population for killing, for committing war crimes, for violence actions. And of course, conviction that you can take someone's territory. It's also a genocidal intention. So when Russians say that we are taking back our territory, when in fact it's not their territory, it's also genocidal rhetoric. And by the way, the very important fact is that not only the acts of genocide are to be punished by international law, the very calls on genocide are also should also be punished. And if we talk about international documents, this convention, I will not say the full name, but the Geneva Convention on Genocide, its article number 3 tells that this act as public incitement to commit genocide shall be punishable.
Right, I think this is very important. Then we link the what people say and what is happening on the ground, what is happening on the battlefield. Let me address Alona right now and ask about changes, about history, about what is changing in this rhetoric. Has it appeared this year? Has it appeared in 2022? Has it appeared in 2014? Has it appeared earlier? What do you say?
Volodya, the fact is that for many decades Russians have been living in the conviction like we will defeat the last enemy and we will finally live happily. Or as an option, who else would you win in order to live happily finally? And the whole problem of Russia is, and the whole tragedy of the countries who are neighbor to the Russian Federation is that Russian propaganda makes them look for an answer for this question, this main question for Russian existence. And nobody knows the response on that, because rhetoric regarding the genocide rhetoric which occurred in Russia, it was already presented in 2014, 2015, but this was most in the context that Ukraine is a Nazi state. And these representatives from so-called Nazi regime, Kiev regime, they all attack people of Donbass, and Russia have to be those who are going to save that people. And of course, it was from time to time, as closer to the full-scale invasion, this rhetoric has become even more aggressive. But even at the beginning of the war, there was a distinction between people and state, because at the beginning of the war, we are not fighting with the Ukrainian, we are saving them. And this is like their understanding that it's necessary to depict Russia as a big country who try to save others' lives. So they are winners, they are protectors, they come to help Ukrainians to save their future. And further, this distinction was gradually disappearing, like Kiev regime transformed Ukraine into totalitarian hypersect and made its citizens to abandon the values of the Orthodox religions, Islam and Judaism. This was the citation of Assistant Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, Alexei Pavlov. He said that in October 2022. So, as we can see, Russian propaganda rhetoric has been definitely changed and become even more aggressive, which lead to explanation to Russians. First of all, why they why they invaded Ukrainians. They are not going to help Ukrainians to save them, to save their lives. They are going to help them to win the so-called Nazi regime of Kiev. And the conquering of Ukraine is the only way to save Ukraine, how it paradoxically can sound like.
Yes, and we also entered, this is of course appalling when a Russian official, Mr. Pavlov, is saying that Kiev regime is a totalitarian hypersect. Well, this is also this mirroring that we discussed in the previous episode, when a democracy is called a totalitarian hypersect, and therefore the fight against this democracy is actually presented by Russian propaganda as the fight against totalitarianism. But there is another quote which you found, a quote of one of the most notorious propagandists, Russian propagandist Vladimir Solovyov, whom we monitor, of course, very closely. And there was many hints that Russians are going to use the nuclear weapon against Ukraine. So what he said, Alena?
In this way, he said, to be honest, too much different things. And every time, we were trying to compare what he said before the annexation of Crimea. And this was wow, if we are going to conquer Ukraine, this would be a crazy thing that we do in our life. But right now we see how he was proud when there's still Russia invaded Crimea, and now in 2022 November we find that the logic is simple. If we have a weapon that can bring an absolute victory, it's strange not to use it. Why did we make it then? This is what Solovyov said on his program, and I think this is one of the example how the rhetoric has been changed. And this is
so instead of just removing one little hypersect or a bunch of Nazis, maybe several thousands or whatever, what they were saying 1 year ago in November 2022, and we remember that this is the time when Russians have already lost Kherson, or maybe were afraid of losing it. There was this idea that if we have a weapon that can bring an absolute victory, this is a quote, it's of course the reference to the nuclear weapons, it is strange not to use it. This is the what these propagandists like Solovyov are saying quite regularly. Nastya, let's address to you. You analyzed again this notorious speech by Mr. Putin just before the invasion, this article about Ukrainian history. And this is the theoretical basis for the further genocidal rhetoric. We can understand it in this way, can't we?
Of course, yes. What's interesting about the addresses of such high-ranking officials as the whole state of the whole head of the state, of course, he cannot use the direct calls on killing, on committing war crimes. But what Mr. Putin does, in fact, is let's call it subtle dehumanization, subtle genocidal rhetoric. Because he creates this background for his mouthpieces to develop and to be more violent in their rhetoric. But they use this background created by their leader. And his notorious article where he reinvented history, like it's real reinvention of history, because he used these historical facts and manipulated them in the most unexpected and surprising ways. So he started erasing this Ukrainian identity from the minds of Russians, and he put it into a certain not legal but formal framework, because his article, his letter is something that can be considered to be official position of Russian state. So what did he say? He said that he was trying to erase this word as Ukrainian from the minds of Russians. He said literally that the word Ukrainian, according to archival documents, initially meant border officers who provided security of external borders. So he told that Ukrainian is actually not the name of a representative of certain nation. It's just the name of a border officer, and accidentally a certain nation started being called like Ukrainians. He also, all the time, he called Ukrainians like little Russians. And he also told that there cannot be historical base for existence of such state as Ukraine. So these were the main lines of his article. And also in his notorious address, when he recognized the independence of so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, he rejected the right of Ukrainians to be a separate state. He told that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for Russia, it's an integral part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. That also makes Russians think that there is no such thing as Ukraine, it's our common space. And he also invented this story about the creation of Ukraine, which was entirely created by Russia, more precisely Bolshevik or communist Russia. This is already this background that led propagandists, so-called experts and journalists be more creative in inventing other stories. And by the way, in his current address on 21st of February to the representatives of the parliament, he also repeated his narratives he used back then.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right to point out that this is a basis for further propaganda. It's formulated in the way that Ukraine does not exist and therefore it can be invaded because it doesn't exist. It's all Russia. And we know that this is a major point of any propaganda, either to say that your enemy does not exist or to say that your enemy does not have a moral right to exist. And then the guys who continue this message, but in a more brutal way, one of these roles is played by former Russian president, who is Dmitry Medvedev, and he's notorious for his actually very, very brutal rhetoric. So, Alona, maybe you can give some quotes of Dmitry Medvedev, how he used genocidal rhetorics against Ukrainians.
Yeah, Volodya, I think everybody knows a huge amount of examples what Medvedev said, because his favorite style is like accusation and dehumanization. And in this way, he's right now the deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, and he uses his Telegram for different kind of statements that he is quite sure he has right to say about that. Let's just remember that statement in November 2022 when he called Ukrainian officials cockroaches, reminding that Kiev is just a Russian city and where people always thought and spoke Russian. So in this way, he even didn't try to understand that Ukraine has its own history. And at the end of this post, Medvedev hinted that everything is very clear and what should be returned and how. So in this way, we see that he already trying to say that Russia is going to return back its land, because some way Medvedev as well as Putin are quite sure that Ukraine lands definitely belongs to Russia Federation. And this is a big problem for Russian propaganda, as there are no protests among the civil society. So it shows how Russian propaganda is working quite good in this way, because nobody wants to opposite these statements, I guess. We haven't seen any kind of protests from the ordinary people.
Well, we did have seen some of the protests, but indeed they are not massive. And, there is still an unknown situation in Russia. We cannot really understand what is going in the society because there are no very true sociological opinion polls. Some of them are saying that there is a minority who support the war and majority is indifferent and just try to avoid it. But let's talk about other officials that we also collected quotes from. These are the Russian parliamentarians. These are the representatives of Russian Security Council. Alona, can you elaborate on that, how they are using genocidal rhetoric?
Vladimir, in some cases, it's definitely one of the evidences of Russian genocide rhetoric. It's Alexei Zhuravlev, who is the deputy of the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation, and as well, he's the first deputy chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee. In this one of the political talk show on Russian one TV channel, during live on, he said, in total we will get 5% of Ukrainians. In simple terms, 2 million people who are now ready to do all this. So while he was talking about the demolition of monuments from the times of the USSR, and who are ready to revive the SS, because Azov is the fascist and the armed forces of Ukraine is the Wehrmacht. Well, it's obvious that is happening. And these 2 million people had either leave Ukraine or be denazified. That is destroyed. As you can see, this is the quote from that TV show, which was broadcasted on May 2022. And in this way, he's openly talk about the idea that 2 million people, 5% of Ukrainians, need to be destroyed. But if he talks about killing, they do not openly say about that. In some ways, they use this new term denazification for Russian propagandists since the full-scale invasion, and they are trying to explain their decision, the idea to invade Ukraine, as the way to denazify from somebody who seems like the threat to Russian Federation and the future of this country, as well as we heard today during the appeal of Putin to Russians that it's denazification of Ukraine is the way to save the country, NATO is going closer to the borders and Russia as the victim has to fight with obvious conquerors. I don't know, somebody who is might destroy the perspective future of Russian Federation. And this is one of the example.
So let's repeat, let's underline this, right? So Russian politician who is called Alexei Zhuravlev, deputy of the State Duma of the Federal Assembly, first deputy chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee, chairman of the political party Rodina, which means motherland, says that 5% of Ukrainians should be killed because they're Nazis, because they're fascists, because something else. 2 million people had either to leave, this is a quote, either to leave Ukraine or to be denazified. That is destroyed. Well, we can translate it as be killed or, I don't know, sent to camps or whatever. Well, this is what Russians have been already doing in the history. 2 million people, Mr. Zhuravlev is saying. It's quite close to those 4 million people killed by Soviet regime during the Holodomor. And next character is Nikolai Patrushev, who is Russian Security Council secretary, and he also has some of interesting statements. said back in November 2022. Alona?
Yeah, he is also one of the representatives of such kind of aggressive statements toward the Ukrainians. And I think we're talking about the statement which he had done at Bryansk during the meeting on security issues in central Russia. In this way, he was trying to explain like the Russia is counteracting the neo-Nazi Kiev regime, which was revived with the support of the collective West. And Russophobia is one of the favorite terms which Russian propagandists used on their TV shows. Whereas probably they use Russophobia as fighting. Russophobia is fighting the genocide of the Russian-speaking population. So in this way, they don't have any the connection between the action activities of Russian army on the territory of Ukraine and the decision of the whole world in some cases to stop Russian Federation. Like no consequences of Russian aggression on Ukrainian territory, but they see only the results, Russophobia as the result, so they call this genocide toward the Russian-speaking population. And this is the way they try to explain that liberation of Ukraine from neo-Nazism will initiate the return the stability of the security in the world. I think this is a kind of the idea, like they are victims who try to save the whole world, not only Ukrainians, as we heard it at the beginning of the full-scale invasion or like a little bit before this full-scale invasion. But right now they are defending the whole world from neo-Nazi and as well as their nation from Russophobia.
Yes, very, very interesting and very, very characteristic. So let's move on, and there are other characters, we can call them so-called officials. They are characters who are actually represent the non-recognized statehoods in the eastern Ukraine, right? Like Pavel Gubarev. Nastya, what does he say? He is actually one of those people who started all this in 2014, who helped the Russian invasion on the ground.
Yes, this character is one of the fathers of so-called DPR. He's not in that so-called republic politics. He keeps his political activism. He owns local medias. He is a mercenary in the armed formations, armed units of those so-called republics. So, but he keeps his propagandist activities, and he says very disgusting things about Ukrainians. He keeps doing that, and what is important here that his opinion is heard by the supporters of so-called DPR, LNR, by those people who live there and support these republics. They listen to him. They hate him. He's quite a popular person there. And his rhetoric, since they are so-called officials, they have their hands more free than other Russian officials. So they can say such awful things as like telling that Ukrainians are possessed by a demon. And he directly told that they are not going to kill Ukrainians, but to change the Ukrainians' minds. And now I will give you a quote. But if you don't want your minds to be changed, we are going to kill you. We are going to kill as many as necessary, 1 million, 5 million. We can exterminate everyone unless you understand you are demoniac and you must be treated. So here he already mixes these crazy imperial Russian ambitions with some demoniac something connected to pseudo-religion. And he tells that Ukrainians should be exterminated, and no matter how many people they are going to kill, they are going to do it unless they reach their aims.
Yes, this is religious fanaticism which is behind Russian propaganda quite often. which we discussed and Nastya actually analyzed in our previous episode of the propaganda diary. But this is a clear genocidal call by a person who is behind these so-called pro-Russian separatists in the eastern Ukraine. Let me repeat this quote. We are going to kill as many as necessary, 1 million, 5 millions. We can exterminate everyone unless you understand you are a demoniac and you must be treated. End of quote. The next character is Mr. Oleg Tsarev, who is used to be a Ukrainian politician who was present in Ukraine and played quite an important role in the pro-Russian political parties. Then he left Ukraine and now I think he's in Russia or on the occupied territories. And he also is saying that Ukraine should not exist as a state. Nastya, can you elaborate?
Yes, this character, we can call him a character because he acts a certain role in this Russian play. So he keeps insisting that Ukraine does not exist. And what is important here as well, he is presented as a former Ukrainian politician, so that in Russian minds, there is this image that not all the Ukrainians are spoiled. There are these so-called correct Ukrainians who have the so-called correct views of this life and of this situation. So he kept saying that Ukraine as a state should not exist. And there are Russian lands. And Russian lands should belong to Russia. And there are no such people as Ukrainian people. And he says literally this. This is our primordially Russian land. These are our people, and if now they are sick with nationalism, but these are our people. It's a 100% denial of existence of the whole nation.
Yeah, so if Ukrainians proclaim themselves as non-Russians, Ukrainians, they are sick people. And the only sound, healthy Ukrainians are those Ukrainians who do not want to be Ukrainians, but want to be Russians. That's a nice logic. And maybe the last character for today is Mr. Alexander Borodai, who actually also Russian citizen and played a big role in this construction of these pro-Russian statehoods, pro-Russian republics. And he's now State Duma deputy member of Russian parliament, chairman of the board of the Union for Donbass Volunteers. And he was saying interesting things back in March. Alona.
Yeah, well, thanks for reminding the Alexander Borodai, because he is those who, as well as others, represent the idea that Ukraine as the state need to disappear, because there was a long discussion, there was an official discussion of so-called Russian experts where they were discussing what will happen if NATO tries to close the sky over Ukraine, as well as can we call Ukrainian and Russian as one nation. And this is what he said, like Ukraine as the state need to disappear, because Ukrainians, I think this is the only way to show that Ukraine is quite a powerful state, which for Russians seems to be quite aggressive. But I don't think that this is the way Russia tried to discredit Ukraine on the international area. Seems the idea that Ukraine is the state, is the state that needs to disappear, is more focused on their Russians. Just to explain the reasons of so-called special military operation. And as we already discussed, like the previous one, all the politicians focus on the idea that it's necessary to show Ukraine as the state, as the part of Russia, in case if we are not agree, we need to be fully destroyed.